Thank you for joining the Education Writers Association for today's webinar, Making Sense of Early Learning Policy. I'm Ellie Yu, a senior reporter at LAist 89.3, an NPR affiliate station here in Los Angeles, covering early childhood. Before we dive in, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have a question for any of our speakers, you can drop them in the Q&A with your name and affiliation. You can ask your question at any time, and we'll get to them during the audience Q&A at the end. You'll also be getting an evaluation survey after today's webinar, so please make sure to complete it. Your feedback is really important and helps EWA improve. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'll introduce myself and then I'll introduce our panelists. I'm a reporter at LAist, as I mentioned, formerly known as KPCC. I started at this station as an investigative reporter and took on this beat for early childhood last fall. In my coverage, I've been exploring the issues and forces that affect the lives of the youngest Angelenos and their families, from healthcare to childcare and everything in between. I've learned how early childhood is one of the most crucial periods of a child's development and how it can really impact them for the rest of their life. And I also became a first-time mom in 2021, an experience that's opened my eyes to the issues of facing young children and their caregivers sort of firsthand. Today, I'm joined by the National Women's Law Center's Catherine Menefee, Karen Schulman, and Kira Weber. Catherine serves as counsel for income security and will discuss various tax credits for families and employers and the degrees of impact that those credits have on addressing the childcare crisis. Karen, who is the director of state child care policy, researches and writes about childcare and early education policies. And Kira is the center's senior manager of state policy and outreach and was the primary author of the recent 2023 report that we'll be talking about today. So I will turn it over to Karen.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and for your interest in childcare and early education. I seem to be having some instability in my internet connection, so I apologize in advance if I lose the connection. So I am and the rest of the team are with the National Women's Law Center. We are a nonprofit policy organization that works to advance gender justice. We work on a range of issues. We work on reproductive health and rights. We work on workplace justice in areas such as fair pay. We work on education policy in areas such as Title IX. We work on income security and issues that are wide-ranging, including tax and budget policy. And we work on the child care and early education issues we'll be speaking about today. We look at this issue from a variety of perspectives, including both the women and their families who rely on child care so that women can work or attend an education or program or so to advance their child's development. We also look at it from the perspective of the child care workforce who provides this crucial care, and that is so essential. And it's a workforce that is primarily women and disproportionately women of color. So we focus on that as well. We look at all types of care, including child care centers, as well as home-based family child care that's licensed, as well as license-exempt family, friend, and neighbor care, or more informal child care. And we use a variety of approaches in our advocacy, including advocacy at the federal level on legislation, on looking at providing input on legislation, and on regulatory policy. We work at the state level. We work with our networks of child care advocates at the state level, at the national level, and we also write reports. And one of our major reports is one I'm working on right now. It's an annual report that looks at some key state child care assistance policies that will be released sometime later in the spring. That looks at policies such as income eligibility limits and the payment rates to child care providers. In a minute, Kira will be talking about the other major report we do, which looks at state developments each year. And I'll also note, as Kat will be speaking about in a minute, after following Kira. We work both on the child care subsidies, the child care assistance that goes directly to parents, as well as child care tax policy designed to help families pay for child care. And we look at both the strengths and weaknesses of all these policies. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kira.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. I'm Kira. Thank you so much for inviting me to join today's discussion. I'm briefly going to highlight a few key pieces of information about the childcare field and two helpful resources that we've created at the National Women's Law Center. So just first, childcare has been underfunded for a long time, and the pandemic made this evidently clear. Even though Congress allocated stabilization funds to childcare during the pandemic through the American Rescue Plan Act, the funds were helpful in stabilizing the field, but they only went so far. And so now, currently, the childcare supply is shrinking and becoming increasingly unaffordable following the expiration of federal childcare funding last September, which included $24 billion in childcare stabilization grant funding. And the second portion of this funding is set to expire this September unless additional long-term funding is provided by the federal government. So to show how families and early educators are being impacted by the expiration of these funds, we've created an interactive map to track what is happening in each state. And I think someone's going to drop the link in the chat. So what we and our coalition partners have confirmed is the expired federal funding has made it more difficult for states to address issues within their childcare systems due to a lack of resources. So while federal funding is ultimately crucial to addressing the full scope of the childcare crisis, states also have an important role to play in supporting progress on childcare through investments and innovative policies, which is why we've produced a new report called Continuing Progress that highlights budget and state legislative developments on childcare and early education in 2023 from all 50 states. So our report found that both red and blue states made progress in 2023 to adopt policies and/or allocate resources to expand families' access to childcare opportunities and better support the childcare workforce. For example, Kentucky was the first state to make teachers and other staff working in licensed or certified childcare programs categorically eligible for child care assistance to cover childcare costs for their own children. Let's see, and in Illinois, the state invested $300 million in new funding in early childhood initiatives, including $170 million for the childcare system. And Wisconsin allocated $170 million in leftover pandemic funds to continue the child care counts program through June of 2025. However, not all states had success in 2023. One example is in Idaho. Its legislature declined to appropriate over $50 million in ARPA funds, which were designated to support early care and education. So we hope that this report can serve as a useful resource for reporters who are seeking to learn more about their state's recent legislative history in the childcare space. And this is also beneficial context to have as current legislative sessions consider childcare policies. And so with that, I will pass it to my colleague, Kat.
Hi, I'm Kat. Oh, am I freezing? Can you hear me? Okay, there we go. I'm Kat, also with the center. Thank you so much, Kira. I'm working on mostly tax policy. So what I'm going to be doing is walking you through tax credits related to childcare. So I'm going to try to bring up the presentation now. Let's see. All right, you should be looking at the presentation. I believe we are. So I'm going to be talking about tax credits related to childcare. I'm also going to be talking about why these tax credits are not sufficient to address the childcare crisis. So the first type of tax credit I'm talking about is childcare related tax provisions that help families. And I want to make a quick distinction here, which is that I'm not referring to the child tax credit. You might have heard of this tax credit. Is expanded in 2021 and provided monthly payments to families. There's also another expansion moving through Congress right now. This is a tax credit that provides a credit to families who are raising children, and it can be very beneficial in many ways, but is not specifically for child care assistance. So I'm going to be talking about, I think I got us out of the presentation here in just a second. I'm going to be talking about tax credits that are specifically for child care assistance. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Federal Child Independent Care Tax Credit, or the CDCTC. This federal credit has 28 state child independent care tax provisions, that many of which are linked to this federal credit. Now, 25 states have credits and 4 states have deductions, and 15 of those state credits are refundable. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more as I move through the presentation, but when I say that a tax credit is refundable, that means that families with low tax liability, so families who do not make enough money to have a high tax bill, they can still receive the tax credit as a refund at the end of the tax season. However, for credits that are non-refundable, the tax credit can only be applied against tax liability. So if you don't have a very big tax bill because you don't make very much money, then you aren't able to fully benefit from these credits. Unfortunately, the federal credit is non-refundable, and I'll sort of talk us through how this works for families as we move through. So how do these tax revisions work? The way it works is that families claim their out-of-pocket child independent care tax expenses at the end of the year when they file their taxes. These expenses must generally be related to parents looking for work or working. So it might be things like putting your children in daycare so that you can go to work, putting your children in summer care so that you can look for a new job. And these expenses must be under a certain limit. For the federal credit, for one child, you can claim up to $3,000, and for 2 children, you can claim up to $6,000. And then you'll get a percent of that expense back as a credit, depending on your income. Now I'm going to move through an example so that we can see how this works. So how do these provisions help families? These child independent care provisions either reduce the amount of taxes families owe and or provide tax refunds if they are refundable. So the example I'm going to give is there's a single mother with 2 children who lives in Silver Spring. She receives $30,000 per year in annual income, and she spends $6,000 of that month, $6,000 of that on childcare expenses. So theoretically, she should be able to claim that full $6,000 for the federal credit, and she gets a percent of it back as a federal credit. In this case, she should be able to receive $1,620 for that federal credit. And then because she lives in Maryland, there's also a Maryland child care credit that should give her $518 as a percent of that federal credit. Now, theoretically, she should be able to receive all of that. However, because she has a low income, she doesn't owe that many taxes. So the most in taxes she's going to owe is $923. Because the federal credit is not refundable, she's only going to get $923 of that credit to go against that federal tax liability. So that's the maximum she's going to receive, $923. And then because the Maryland credit is linked to that federal credit, she's also going to get less of that as well. She's going to get $295 of that Maryland child care credit. So because of the non-refundability of the federal credit, you can see that families with lower incomes don't receive the full value of child independent care tax provisions. I also want to say, I mentioned a Maryland tax credit when I was giving that example. Wanted to say the National Women's Law Center provides a yearly resource in which we track and list out all of the state tax provisions related to childcare. You can see a part of that chart here now. We list all the provisions. We put the ones that are refundable, so actually help families with low income, in bold. And then we provide the maximum value that families can receive. And that resource will be shared with you either now or at the end. So what are the limitations of these provisions? I just talked about how the non-refundability of the federal credit and several of the state credits limits how many families with low income can benefit. But it's important to say that even if these credits were made fully refundable, they would still not be sufficient to address the childcare crisis. These credits are at most a small complementary role in providing childcare assistance for families. They do not increase the childcare supply or help childcare providers, so they must be paired with robust direct childcare assistance. But as far as improving them, as I said, making the federal child and dependent care tax credit refundable would make it more available for families. States should also work to make their credits refundable and to make sure there's a workaround so that families can receive the full refundable credit, even though the federal credit is non-refundable. Now, I also want to talk very briefly about other childcare related tax provisions. The reason why I'm not giving as much space to these is because these do not meaningfully help families with low incomes to get childcare assistance, and they do not help the childcare build the childcare supply. But I'm bringing them up because some federal and state policymakers have recently showed renewed interest in expanding these provisions. So I want to talk through why expanding and improving these provisions is not the right way to address the childcare crisis. The first I'm going to talk about is the Child Care Assistance Program, or DCAP for short, and the employer provided child care credit. So the first, the Dependent Care Assistance Program, or DCAP, what it does, it allows employees to put $5,000 of their pre-tax dollars for child care expenses, but only if their employer permits it. An employer has to offer this program. Unfortunately, most employers that offer this program are more high income employers, more corporate employers, so many poorly paid employees are not able to benefit. One research from 2020 found that families with making 100,000 or more received the majority of the benefit, and that families making less than 30,000 received around 1% of the benefit. It's also worth saying this is only useful for families who actually have money to set aside, right? They're setting aside their own money and getting a tax benefit from that. So this isn't going to help families that aren't able to, say, have $5,000 in order to put it away. It doesn't give families more resources to pay for childcare expenses. The other credit is the employer-provided childcare credit. What this does is it allows businesses to claim the credit if it provides childcare benefits to its employees. This credit is meant to incentivize employers to provide childcare benefits to their employees, such as on-site childcare, referrals to other childcare services. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually play out that way in practice. There's the federal credit and the 19 state credits, most of which are modeled off the federal credit, but these are not widely used. In 2021, less than 1% of federal corporate tax returns actually claimed the federal credit. And since 2002, 10 states have either discontinued or let their employer tax credits expire because they weren't widely used. Now, why aren't these tax credits widely used? First off, there's significant upfront and ongoing costs to provide childcare, and many small and many medium-sized and even large employers are not able to provide those large upfront costs. So the employers most likely to be able to do this are big corporate employers. But even in employers that provide childcare on site, not all employees are going to benefit. It was found that most the childcare tends to be more available at corporate headquarters, but not at warehouse distribution or retail locations, again, limiting the employees that are able to benefit. So just to summarize real quickly before I go into resources, There are tax credits like the Child Care Independent Tax Credit at the federal level and several related state credits that can help some families meet some of their child care expenses. But there are ways to improve these credits, but even if they were improved, they are not the full solution to the childcare crisis. They are a small complementary role that would need to be paired with robust investments. And then these other two credits that I've been talking about, DCAP and the employer provided child care credit, do not meaningfully help families and do not increase the child supply. So they should not be focused on when we're talking about how to improve the child care crisis. So at the end here, I'm just going to talk about some resources. The one I talked about before, which is at the top here about all the states that provide child care, child independent care tax provisions. There's our list there in that resource. Then there's a couple other resources about why the other credits do not help address the child care crisis, and some more about the federal child independent care tax credit. I've also included my email there at the end if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'll get started with some questions and then we'll turn to the Q&A. So what experts are calling the nation's childcare crisis is obviously multifaceted. We have families not being able to afford care, providers struggling to pay teachers, and early educators themselves struggling to afford working for low pay. I think the U.S. Treasury Secretary has called the childcare system a market failure. Given the various ways people are affected, how are policymakers tackling this from all these different angles, if they are? Feel free to jump in, any of you, but Karen, I'll start with you.
Yes, so at the state level, we are seeing a number of policymakers try to address this sort of double-edged problem where the families are struggling and the child care workforce is struggling. So we are seeing a number of states raising income eligibility limits for child care assistance, so more families can receive the direct subsidies to help pay for child care. We're seeing some states raise the payment rates they provide to those child care programs that are serving families receiving child care assistance. They're lowering the copays expected of families who are receiving child care assistance. And they're also adopting some initiatives to help boost child care wages and salaries and compensation. It ranges in the amount. We see DC had pretty generous benefits to supplement child care providers' salaries. In California, some home-based child care providers bargained for actually retirement benefits. You probably familiar with that. Again, it's sort of small and it's still unclear how it will be implemented, but they're looking forward. There's also some efforts to invest in the supply of child care because to grow the supply. Now, many of these efforts are funded with the remainder of those federal child care relief dollars. But we are seeing some states invest some of their own money. Vermont took a major step forward with an initiative that is funded by a payroll tax. The DC initiative I mentioned is based on a tax of higher income earners. So states are taking different approaches to it, and they're trying to tackle it from all angles. It's uncertain but states have taken various creative and important initiatives forward. But it's not every state, so we still need that federal action. And also we don't know how long it'll be sustained. There has been some progress at the federal level in terms of necessarily increasing the funding for the main child care program, the federal Child Care and Development Block Grant Program. We saw a recent increase in the federal appropriations that was approved over late at the last minute this weekend. So states will have more resources to work with. But we'll see how it plays out over the coming months and years. Another thing I wanted to mention is that there will be continued federal state changes driven by a recent federal rule, a regulation for the main child care program, the Child Care and Development Block Grant Program, which will require states to take some steps. So we're going to see states continue to move forward in terms of the co-payments they require of families and how they pay child care providers to make it more like the private market. So I can get into that if there's more interest, but I'll turn it over to Kira to see if she has anything to add.
No, I think that you did a pretty good job of rounding that out between the states and federal government. So.
Speaking of state, I guess I'll call out some states. We have some reporters tuning in from Idaho, Colorado, Wisconsin. Any exciting any policies there being proposed? That you're watching.
Well, Kira mentioned the money that Idaho did not take advantage of, and so we'll continue to see the advocates made some small progress on their child care assistance program, increasing the income eligibility limit, but there's still that money that they lost the opportunity to use, and so we'll see how that unfolds. Wisconsin, as Kira mentioned, the governor pushed for them to continue some stabilization grants to child care providers, and the legislature didn't provide it. Instead, he found some extra federal relief money to use for that, and he's still continuing to push forward. I saw that he did sign a bill, and I don't know if Kat has more to say on that, but it was to expand a child care tax credit, but it's non-refundable. And as Kat has very clearly explained, that means that the benefits won't be as available to lower income families. And, you look at the benefits, the amount of the benefits, and it's important, every bit helps, but it's a few $100s or a few $1,000s, and you compare that to the annual cost of childcare, which can be $10,000-$20,000 a year for one child, and it's just a drop in the bucket. And why, as the governor was signing the bill, he was saying that this isn't the full solution. We also need direct assistance to the child care system and for families. In Colorado, they're working on a measure that would implement that is sort of parallel to what the federal government would require under the new federal regulations, and in terms of paying providers prospectively in advance. So this is for providers who are serving families receiving assistance. They would be paid in advance, and they would be paid based on enrollment, so that if a child has a slot for a month, they receive the full month payment, even if the child is absent some of those days. That's how it works in the private market. It hasn't always worked that way for families receiving subsidies, and that both either disincentivizes childcare providers from serving families receiving assistance, and those providers who do serve those families can be deprived of resources. So the federal rule, and states will be following to implement it, are trying to move towards a system that works better for families and childcare providers. And there are some other provisions as well. But so Colorado has been a leader. They've moved forward on their childcare assistance program, and they're continuing to move forward on that. And if Kira or Kat have anything else to add.
And a follow on that, in states where you are seeing legislation being passed, are these efforts bipartisan? What's sort of the conversation like that's happening, like in getting this legislation passed?
Yeah, so we're in such partisan times. Childcare is generally, we see a broader bipartisan effort, not complete, and there are differences in the willingness to commit money or to provide provide the scale that they're willing to commit to. However, we've seen widespread recognition. We've seen progress, as Kira mentioned, in Kentucky. They were the ones who came up with this innovative policy to provide childcare assistance, regardless of income, to the childcare workforce. So we saw advancements there. Alabama made significant investments. We saw North Dakota make some improvements in their childcare policies. So it's not just a red state, blue state. It's pretty across the board. We're seeing states recognize the value, the way, the emphasis and how advocates might talk about the childcare might differ. The scale of the investment, I mean, you're not going to necessarily see a Vermont scale initiative in every state, but you are seeing recognition and that it's crucial to the well-being of families and to the business, to states' economy. So we've seen a number of advocates in more conservative states really bring in some business allies, small business allies, and sometimes the local chamber of commerce to make the case that, well, if we need to, if we're going to have a viable workforce, if we're going to be able to support people in the workforce, we need to support the child care system, the child care sector. So that has been effective. And then there's also, there's child care providers in every district. So I think that is also a voice that is heard. So I don't know if Kira or Kat has anything to add. And I think Kat was going to make a comment maybe on the last question as well.
Oh, I was just going to add a little bit about what you said about the importance of refundability when it comes to states providing child independent care tax provisions. And I just wanted to also lift up Colorado as once again, an example of a state that has provided a tax credit that is fully refundable for child independent care tax expenses. And not only that, but made it so that families who are low income, who are not able to get the federal credit or don't benefit much from the federal credit, they've made it so that they're still able to access the Colorado credit. So just lifting up the importance of the refundability and some examples of states that are doing good work there.
Karen, I think you mentioned Kentucky as sort of being innovative in sort of cost of childcare for early childhood educators. We had a question come in the Q&A. If you're seeing any other states kind of take this approach or have conversations about this?
Yeah, I like Kira because a number of states are doing it. I don't remember which states Kira might recall. I'll let Kira.
Well, I'll probably send it back to you, Karen, see if you remember any. I know that Kentucky was the first to do it. I believe Rhode Island followed closely behind and has done categorical eligibility as well. And I believe there's a number of states trying to pass it this session, although I can't remember them off the top of my head right now.
Are there any trends you're seeing kind of across states? I know states are doing a lot of different various policies, but like what you said, is there movement sort of catching on or a policy that's sort of catching on kind of national?
I think that policy is one of the key ones where we're seeing that we were talking about in terms of making childcare workers eligible. That's caught on quicker and more widespread than we've seen with other innovations. And I think it's a really critical aspect because it both, it helps the childcare workers and it's trying to address the shortage. I don't know that there's any sort of trend, as I said, that there are a number of states increasing their income eligibility limits. We are seeing a number of states provide salary supplements. The range of the scale, it's usually not. DC provided a really significant benefit. Others, it's smaller. We're seeing some other other initiatives to try to boost the supply and quality of care. I think that, there's just there's no magic bullet on this, though, and it does take resources. So I'm not, I don't know that there's a trend so much as trying to kind of work from all different places. I don't know, Kira, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I would agree with you. I think that it's mostly that that states are trying to make it more affordable. And they're coming from all different angles at that, and however they can at this point.
I wanted to ask about one state. I think in your report there were mentions of zoning laws and land use development, for example, in Arkansas. Can you talk about how like zoning laws intersect with early care and education?
I can start off on this one. So I think that childcare happens in different types of settings. And I think that typically people immediately think of center-based care, which is a business, right? And a big building like that. But childcare also happens in providers' homes. And so that's a residential property, and the two are zoned differently. For instance, businesses require like a specific type of sprinkler system throughout like their building, which we don't require in like a residential setting. You probably don't have that in your home. And so these types of zoning requirements can make it they can be a huge like financial burden and otherwise on home-based providers who are trying to provide childcare in their home. And so in the case of Arkansas, the state approved a bill requiring local governments to treat family childcare providers as residential properties for the purpose of zoning, meaning it becomes easier for them to provide care in their homes and not having to worry about requirements that like a large business might have to have that doesn't make sense necessarily to have in a residential home. Karen, do you want to add anything?
No, that was great. I'll just say just more generally, we talk about the shortage of childcare and the drop off and the struggles of childcare providers struggling of trying to survive given the economics of it and we also think, as Kira said, we often think of centers, but it's really family childcare. We've seen like a steady drop off, and this is a trend that goes back long before the pandemic. We've just seen this big decline, and it really is an important option for many families. Many families prefer a smaller home-based setting, so it's a real concern that they are, dropping off, and the struggles come from many different directions on why it is hard for them to survive, both the getting enough income, being able to charge enough, and these issues around zoning and whether they can operate a family child care program in a certain neighborhood, their individual struggles of whether they can afford to pay the rent or mortgage given their income and it just sort of the additional pressures. There's also issues with the there's a program, the child and adult care food program, and the way it's designed is not, it's sort of parallel to like the school lunch program except for childcare, and the payments for family child care providers are very inadequate. So family child care provider, we think of all child care providers as under a lot of financial stress, but family child care providers sort of even more compounded, and they're facing these different issues in terms of paying their mortgage or rent and meeting zoning laws and not having enough support for the meals that they provide during the child care day to the children they're serving. So it's even more of a strain, and it's a great loss if they're not there to serve families, because they often offer an option that could be preferred for a small child where you want a small setting for a more home-like feel for a child, or maybe during odd hours or non-traditional hours when the parents are working. So there are a lot of risk, and there will be a lot of implication for many families who depend on that. So we are seeing a number of states start to look at that and start to push on it. Of course, Colorado, because they seem to be the state we're talking about a lot, took some action, and I believe Oklahoma, is that right, Kara? Oklahoma.
Yeah,
Well,
that's correct.
Interesting. Kat, I know you're an expert on the tax team at the National Women Law Center. You talked about how tax programs are not the way to solve the childcare crisis. Like, how should we think about how tax policy impacts children's development and early learning outcomes? Like, how should we think about tax policy as we're covering this? I know we've heard a ton about the child tax credit nationally, for example, and you're talking about a lot of other programs that are not that. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I sort of discussed, the tax provisions that are child specifically for childcare have some limitations. We talk about how child independent care tax provisions, can be improved and can help some families, but like you said, they are not comprehensive. We really need direct childcare investments in order to really address the childcare crisis. So when we think about tax credits, I think we try to think of those that I just described as sort of a small complementary role can help families. But I also want to give some space for other ways that tax credits might intersect with childcare. So the first you raised, which is the child tax credit, obviously it's something that's moving through Congress right now. It was previously expanded in 2021. Again, this is another complementary role to direct childcare investments, but I think I'd be remiss not to say that help providing families with additional income support can help them in a range of ways, including through childcare. So we do always want to support expansions to the child tax credit, both at the federal and the state level. And I think another way to think about taxes is, tax can be a really great opportunity in order to provide us with more revenues in order to invest in childcare. So obviously, this is very important for it to happen at the federal level. There are many opportunities to tax the wealthy and the corporations at a more equitable way in order to raise more revenues and invest in childcare at the federal level. Though, of course, also as Karen mentioned, this can happen at the state level. DC has done a tax that taxes high earners and then can invest that in childcare. So I don't think we need to think of tax as only on the side of tax credits, right? Tax can also be a way to raise money in order to invest in childcare. Because that's really what we really need in order to address the childcare crisis. And anything on the tax credit side is going to be of a more complementary role.
I'm going to turn it over to the Q&A. I think we answered one question, but we have a question from Idaho. Katie McGuire, freelance journalist with Idaho Education News, asked, could you mention a few stakeholders they should try to talk to and try to understand what is happening with early childcare education in Idaho? Anyone that comes to mind? Any groups?
We do have some contacts in Idaho, I believe. Is it the Idaho AEYC, the Association for the Education of Young Children? We can find you that contact and provide that for you. There were groups. They did a really great, a lot of great advocacy work there on those funds that they were losing an opportunity to use, and so there are some good voices there, so we can track down those contacts and share.
I'll ask a question, and any of you can answer this. And what are some undercovered stories that you'd like to see reporters cover or investigate in early childhood?
Well, for a long time, early childhood in itself had been long undercovered. So we've been, well, I mean, it shouldn't have taken such an immense crisis to pay attention to this ongoing crisis that has been there in the picture for a long time. So it's just important to address it, not only from the cost that families are struggling with, particularly the focus on low-income families, particular burdens for them, as well as the women who are in this profession, and how they're struggling to make ends meet, working in the field of childcare and early education. We also work, I was mentioning family childcare, and often like that's the licensed family childcare. There's also a sector, the more informal care, family friend and neighbor care, which is often overlooked. And they're really crucial part in all. It's relied on by families with children of all ages, families at all income levels. It's particularly important for families working non-traditional hours. There's often not a formal license program available for them, so they rely on more informal caregivers, families, friends, and neighbors. We often overlook it. It's often not easily, doesn't lend itself to automatic policy solutions. It's often outside of it, but it affects such a vast portion of the children receiving care, either along with other arrangements that families patch together or on its own. It's many, it's a very diverse group, these family friend and neighbor care providers. Some are providing it for a long term, and they look a lot like your more formal home-based family childcare providers. In some cases, it's just a grandparent, grandmother, or some other relative providing care just for that child for a temporary amount of time. But it's really important to include it, because if we don't include it, we leave out a lot of families and a lot of children. And many children, they choose family friend and neighbor care because it matches their cultural background or language. So it's just really an important aspect of the system that doesn't always get the attention it really should, given how it's so central to many families. I think also the point that Kat was making about the tax and budget policies and how it's connected, and sometimes we focus on the specific policy just as a sort of standalone and look at like childcare and how can we fix it within the existing resource set. But I think it's really important, childcare policy is budget and tax policy, because we need to look at ways we can expand the pool of resources, and make the commitment to investing it, because we're not going to be able to solve it, one family at a time, one childcare provider at a time, or even when, states are coming up with innovative solutions, and it's important for them to be part of it. But we're also not going to solve it one state or one community at a time. We really need a significant investment, and that will come from a fair tax system that asks the people with greater resources to make this investment in our childcare program. So I think I'm thinking about that. So I don't know if Kat or Kira had other things to add.
I'll just plus one what you were saying about looking at the tax system holistically, and the way we look at the tax system, who we tax and where we invest those revenues really shows what we value in a society. And so if we want to show that we value women and families and children, then taxing wealthy and corporations, making sure they pay their fair share in order to invest in programs like childcare that help them, would really show that we value families and children in society. So just always upping that.
We have another question in the Q&A. Does the National Women Law Center have any recommended resources that break down the federal changes to receiving child care development block grants, subsidies?
Do you mean in terms of the rules, in terms of the new regulations? Is that?
I think that sounds like Yeah, the new rule.
We can we have not produced any resources, but some of our great partners have produced some materials that we can would be happy to share. The Office of Child Care has put together some resources, including a slide presentation and a summary of the changes in the regulations. Child Care Aware of America has put together a brief summary. We're working in partnership as well with another organization too, to provide some aspects. So, and we're happy to talk through with you some changes. So we can track down those links and try to find them, put in the chat.
Obviously, we're past the childcare pandemic cliff that everybody's talked about. We went over last fall, in which the pandemic dollars have expired. What are you seeing? Like, what are you hearing from states of center? Yeah, on the ground of centers closing or yeah.
So the National Women's Law Center has been tracking the impacts, and we have a map with links to various articles that shows the impact on it. We're seeing in a number of locations programs closing or families paying more. The National Association for the Education of Young Children had a survey showing the number of large percentage of programs are raising fees for families. So we are seeing impacts on both the families who need care and the providers of care. It's not it's an uneven picture, right? So some states that have put in some additional investments have been able to stave off the large impacts of it. Minnesota put a really significant investment in addition to some of the other states we've been talking about. So those states are in a little bit better shape. Some states we have not seen the impact yet because they've either been able to put together the funds or there was a portion of funds that have already expired. There's another portion of the federal relief funds that don't expire until this coming September. So it's not like the results were seen all at once. So, and also states have been in a little bit better financial position. So they've been able to have money. So if any of as the last of that money starts to expire, if states start to be not as well positioned, partly they were well positioned because they had all of those federal resources relief resources, not just for childcare, but more broadly coming to them. As all of those funds start to expire, states could be a little worse positioned. So we may not have felt the full effects yet, and we're already feeling them. And, we're just talking about trying to stay at the bad place we were when the pandemic started, which already was a place where families struggled to find childcare workers were paid poverty level wages. Parents didn't have the choices they want. It was hard to afford. So, we can't really be just satisfied with just getting back to where we were. We really want to advance. So the National Women's Law Center continues to advocate for continues to advocate for $16 billion in stabilization childcare funding, as well as for the long-term type of investment in really expanding our childcare system, such as was proposed in it's not going to necessarily advance, but the president did include a continued proposal for a significant investment that would really be moving towards a universally available child care system that adequately supported families and the child care and early learning educators.
All right. I think that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank our panelists, Catherine, Karen, and Kira, again for joining us today. Thank you to the attendees and EWA members for engaging with us on this important conversation. You'll get an evaluation survey at the end. I think you'll be emailed that, so make sure to fill that out if you get a chance. And thank you, everyone. Have a great day.